So I'm going to be talking tonight about Ancestry.com DNA. You can go ahead and advance one. Yeah. This is from 17 DNA jokes and pickup lines, which apparently there are. And it says, what does DNA stand for? National Dyslexia Association. That's probably not politically correct, but it'll take you a second and then you'll realize why it's funny. All right, never mind. National Dyslexia Association would be NDA instead of DNA, but that's all right. Never mind. All right. So this actually happened to me. The guy saying, rinse and we'll try again. I collected more Doritos than DNA. A cousin of mine told me that she's in her upper 80s and she wanted to get her older brother to do a DNA test. And she told me the ordeal she went through to try to get him to spit in the tube properly and realized that he was taking sips of his coffee with milk in it in the middle of it all. And I said, you know, he might come up with some cow DNA as a result of that. So we're not sure really whatever happened to the results, but they never showed up. But anyway, I'm curious to know in the audience, who has done a DNA test? So it's a majority actually of who's here. And who of you have, put your hands back up. I want to see who did it. Take your hand down if you did not do Ancestry DNA. I'm confusing everyone. Who's done Ancestry DNA? So about half of the number. Who has done the Ancestry.com DNA test? Yeah, so about half. This is not an advertisement or promotion of Ancestry.com DNA. That's just what I'm familiar with. But it also, as I understand it, is the DNA testing service that has the greatest number of participants and the greatest genealogical the greatest, most advanced genealogical features, and I believe that is to be the case. So I'm going to talk specifically about Ancestry.com autosomal DNA. I'm not going to be talking about Y chromosome DNA, which is a test that you do to verify male lineages. I'm not going to be talking about, did I say mitochondrial? Mitochondrial DNA, which you use to test female lineages. What I'm going to talk about is autosomal DNA, and autosomal DNA is testing all of your chromosomes, and it's what's used to try to find matches to relatives that aren't in your male line or in your all-female line. And it's what most people do these days when they get a DNA test from Ancestry.com or 23andMe or MyHeritage. And that's what we'll be talking about tonight. It does touch upon in a couple of places in my presentation, mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA, and I'd be happy to answer questions about that. But just so that you understand, I'm talking about the generic autosomal DNA test that you can get for $100. I don't know what the other services charge. Ancestry charges $100 normally, and it's on sale now for $60. So anyway. So when you do an Ancestry DNA test, you buy the test and they send you a kit, and you basically spit in a tube, seal it up. You mix it up to mix the agent with the saliva, and send it to Ancestry DNA. You register your account, and then I'm not quite sure what the timeline is now, but a couple months later, they will notify you. You put your email address into your account, and they'll notify you that your test results are in, and then you can go in and see. So this is what your Ancestry.com account looks like at your DNA homepage. And you don't have to have an Ancestry.com subscription. You don't have to subscribe to all the resources online and the records and the documents to do the DNA test. You always will have, once you buy a DNA kit, you'll always have an Ancestry DNA account. So it's not like, you know, they're going to take away that if you don't do a subscription Ancestry.com. So just so that you understand that. So there's different choices. I'm not really going to talk about how Ancestry breaks down your ethnicities. That's something that you get as part of doing a test with several of the different services. They change the algorithms to figure out how they will calculate your ethnic breakdown every couple of years. So all of a sudden, I've got a whole bunch of Norwegian, even though I don't have a documented ancestor from Norway in the last 500 years. And I think the conclusion is that the Vikings really got around because I have Scottish and British ancestry, and they're saying that there's Norwegian DNA in there. So it's interesting to see the changes. At one point, I had 2% Jewish, and that just disappeared. So you never know, how they're going to change the algorithms, but they do change every couple of years, and they revise their calculations. So most specifically, I'm going to talk about DNA matches tonight. And what that means is other people that are in the Ancestry.com database who have taken the test are matched up against your DNA. They test I think it's about 7,000 different places on chromosomes to see who has sequencing that matches other people. And depending on how long the sequences are that you have that match someone else, and how many of them there are, they will calculate a probability, which is called centimorgans, and that's basically a measurement of the likelihood of your being descended from a common ancestor. So on your DNA main page, you have these origins on the left, and that is where they do the ethnicity estimate, and then they do your DNA matches, and they also have something called through lines, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So this is my home page, and over on the right-hand side, you'll see it's a pull-down menu where it says View Another Test. I'm going to grab my laser pointer real quick so I can point some things out. So when you do an ancestry DNA test, you can actually let someone else manage it. You can let someone else be a viewer of your matches. And just, I happen to have about 126 other people who let me be a viewer for their account. A number of them are close relatives. Then there's friends, my hair cutter, who wanted me to look into her DNA results. And then I do a large DNA project, relative to descendants of a Scottish couple that came to the Catskills in the 1770s. And that accounts for about 122 out of the 126 that I manage, although the immediate family is also in that project too. So this just happens to be my pull-down menu here on the right, just the very beginning of it up to the letter C. So it keeps going down and down and down, and I can choose any of the accounts to see different people's matches. I just wanted to show you sort of some of the mechanics of how this works. So in addition to doing the test myself, it's also very valuable to have other close relatives do the test. And that applies especially to relatives that are in an earlier generation than yourself if they're still living. So I call them supplemental or surrogate tests because I can use those to find connections that I might not have, or my match might not be sufficient enough to show up. Whereas my aunt, who's one generation closer to my maternal ancestors, she may have matches that would be very valuable for me to understand that I might not have. So the first person there is my late aunt, Barbara Jefferson. This is my brother, my late sister, and then these are my sons. And of course, my sons are important, not necessarily for me to research my own ancestry, because their levels of matches to my relatives are actually going to be lesser than my own. But if I wanted to trace my ex-wife's family, obviously, my son's DNA tests are going to be very important for that purpose. So they're surrogates with regard to my ex-wife's ancestry. So this is an example of, these are my matches. The way that the matches show up is they're listed in order of the highest order of magnitude going down. And so my two sons are listed first here, and it shows you that with my younger son, James, I share 3,483 centimorgans. And with my older son, Alex, I share 3,444 centimorgans. the reality is that half of their DNA came from me. The numbers are slightly different because ancestry tests certain places on the chromosome. So there will be a difference in their number, each of their numbers respectively with me versus with their mom because of where ancestry tests in the DNA itself. And then going down, you can see there's my sister and my brother and my aunt, and they're going to be my highest level matches because they're my closest relatives who have also tested. So this is my match with my son, James, and it gives you a little bit more detail when you choose the match. It tells me that I have, matched across 224 DNA segments. The longest segment is 282 centimorgans. So there's information at Ancestry about how they calculate, how they project DNA matches based on the numbers that you come up with. And they categorize that into different groups. So obviously your children, your full siblings, your aunts and uncles, your first cousins, second cousins, and so on. The lower the number, the more distant the relationship is. And so they go down to 8 centimorgans, which could be a 10th cousin for all you know. They used to go down to 6, and they found out that that was too low. 6 centimorgans was bringing in too many false negatives, just coincidentally shared sequences of DNA that didn't have any significant meaning in terms of being descended from the same ancestors. And so they cut that off a number of years back at 8, and they're refining the technology too, so they understand better where to draw those lines. This so this is Captain Centimorgan, my alter ego, back when my hair was a little darker. So centimorgans, as I said, are a measure of probability of relationship or descent from a common ancestor based on the numbers that they find. And there's information at Ancestry about the likelihood of the relationship depending on the value that you get. So if you have more than 60 centimorgans, it's almost 100% certain that you have ancestry in common. So when you're talking about your children at 3,000 and some, or your siblings, your aunts and uncles, your cousins, you're going to get absolute 100% certainty as far as they're concerned about being related. And this is how they break down the numbers. So, if you have a match between 2,400 and 28, that's typical of a full sibling. If you have a match between 680 and 1150, they're going to categorize that as a first cousin or great-grandchild or great-grandparent. They don't have every possible relationship on here. So I've had a number of people that I've helped over the years that have made assumptions based on this chart and what Ancestry reports, that if you have an 1100 centimorgan match with someone, they must be your first cousin. That doesn't mean that they have to be your first cousin. It means that's the category that they put that amount in. So your half sibling's child, for example, which is a much more common thing than you might think when people start doing their DNA tests, will be categorized as a first cousin. So they're not going to have half niece or half nephew, here. But that's these are broad categories of the relatedness, the distance between you and the other person that's testing, and basically the distance between you and the common ancestor that you share. And if it's a cousin who has a family tree at Ancestry, they will tell you that they've established a link between you and an ancestor and that person and that same ancestor. So this is an example here where, and these all are, oh, you can advance, Bob. So, yeah, go ahead one more. So this is an example, and this is just here from my list. Sorry, it's a small slide, but this is just from my list of matches down at the 100, 146, 155, 142 centimorgan level. These are cousins, and you notice that there's this designation here that says common ancestor. These are all cousins that have genealogical charts attached to their test at Ancestry DNA. And because I have a chart attached to my test and my brothers and sisters and aunts' tests and children's tests, Ancestry can figure out that we have a fairly recent ancestor in common, and they'll chart it out for you. So this is my match with a cousin on the Klett side of my family named Colleen Moberly. And then this is actually, when I click on that match, it says you and Colleen Moberly, and it's saying that we share 145 centimorgans across 7 segments. It shows me her family tree here, and these are my great-grandparents, Gottlieb, Klett, and Pauline Schlenker. So it's showing me how, and it's showing over here too, that these are the ancestors in common, Gottlieb, Klett, and Pauline Schlenker. So this is showing me right there when I click on that match how Colleen and I are related. Ancestry used to have something called DNA circles. They don't do it anymore. And a DNA circle was taking all the people that they found that had DNA matches that were descended from a certain person and basically creating a circle with lines between all of these people descended from a certain person. I think that was it was a great feature early on when they started doing the DNA testing at Ancestry.com, but I think they found that it became pretty unwieldy pretty early on. I don't know for certain that this is why, but I do know some Mormons that are descended from men that had 4 wives and 40 children altogether. And you can imagine the DNA circle, if you've got some people that are testing descended from that person, it starts filling up with lines and gets very, very complicated. So Bob, you can advance one slide. This feature no longer exists at Ancestry, but this is a screen grab that I did years ago, showing a DNA circle that I and my close relatives were all part of from an ancestor who's born in the 1750s, Joseph Fish, who's on my mother's patrilineal ancestor. My mother's maiden name was Fish. And this is what a DNA circle looked like. And you can see that that's very early on, maybe 10 years ago, when they started accumulating data for and building their database. Once the database started getting into the many millions, these DNA circles got a little bit too unwieldy, and they came up with an entirely different feature, which is truly a brilliant piece of software, I think. Bob, you can advance one. And that's called through lines. And in your DNA main page, you can choose to look at your matches. You can search all your matches. You can search in a surname, a place name. You can look at your matches divided by your 2 parents, or you can choose by ancestor. And so if you choose by ancestor, it will actually, this is if you have a family tree at Ancestry. You don't have family tree at Ancestry, it's not going to do this for you. But if you have a family tree at Ancestry, it will take all of your ancestors and sort your matches by the people that are also descended from those ancestors. So those are all my ancestors going back through the generations. And I can click on any one of them and see who else is descended from one of those ancestors of mine. And so this is an example of my ancestor, James Everett, who lived in West Windsor. He was born in 1815 and died in 1898. He had 10 children. And this is showing how I have matches to different of his children, descendants, who have also tested at DNA. So it's sorting all of these matches for me, which is a great deal of work that it's doing with its algorithms and looking at their trees and actually in some cases creating lineages based on historical records for these people and myself. One thing that this cannot do, though, is figure out how someone is related to you if they don't have a family tree connected to their Ancestry DNA test. So this might only be a small subset of all the people at Ancestry DNA who are descendants of my ancestor, James Hughes Everett, that I match. But these are the ones that Ancestry can tell me they definitely know are descendant, if you can follow me. So if you don't attach, it's very important when you do the Ancestry DNA test to attach a family tree, even just a couple generations. Because if you do a couple generations, Ancestry will extrapolate your ancestry from there. And then it can start doing these through lines matches for you. It's a very powerful tool to do genealogical research. So this is actually through lines chart for my aunt, Barbara Jefferson. And this is our ancestor, Joseph Fish. I showed you, I'm not sure the DNA circle that I showed you before, whether that was for Joseph Fish Sr. or Joseph Fish Jr., but this is actually Joseph Fish Sr., who is born in 1767. And these are my aunt's matches to other descendants of Joseph Fish Sr. through his different children. And you can see going across, there's quite a few matches. I think she's got 144 just from this ancestor. And that's only going to be a fraction of the ones that are actually there, because those are only the ones that have family trees showing their lineage back to Joseph Fish. And so you can see, you know, there 22 matches from the son Abraham, 18 matches from the daughter Mercy, 26 matches from the daughter Mary, 18 matches from the daughter Phoebe. This is the ancestor the child that we're descended from, Joseph Jr., and then goes on to Oliver, and there are other children too that we don't have any matches yet. So this is, you can see how very powerful this is, that they have this through lines feature. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this is just part of what you get when you do the ancestor DNA test, which is you know, there are other features that the other services have, but I think this is somewhat unique to Ancestry.com. So this is, again, my cousin on the Klett side, Colleen Moberly, and I'm just bringing this slide up to show how I track the DNA matches that I find, just sort of my own personal record keeping. So this is my family tree, and so this is my great-grandfather here, Caspar Gottlieb Klett, came to America in 1882 from Germany, and Colleen and I share him as an ancestor. And so in my information, in my genealogy database for him, in the notes, I actually record all of the matches that I have to cousins who he is our most recent common ancestor. And that establishes for me the confirmation of my genetic descent from that ancestor, if you follow me. So in other words, if you and I are cousins and we're showing a match at an expected level for the relationship of our cousins, the ancestors that we have in common, whether it's our grandparents or great-grandparents, our genetic lineage from those ancestors is confirmed by the fact that you and I have this match. Does that make sense to everyone? So you can build a tree based on the matches that you have, in which you can confirm your genetic descent from your ancestors based on what cousins you're finding matches to. So this is just in my record for Gottlieb Klett, however many Ancestry.com autosomal DNA matches I've found. They range in different levels, but these are all just documented matches from people that are also descended from those ancestors. And there's Colleen Moberly down at the bottom, and the matches that she has to myself, to my sister, to my brother, to my sons. This is another example where my great-grandmother from Hopewell, Keturah Everett Pearson, these are matches that I'm tracking that I have with people that I've tested at Ancestry DNA that are also descended from her. But I wanted to point this out because in this case, because there's so much intermarriage between the early families in Central Jersey and in the Hopewell area, some of these matches that I have with people that are also descended from Keturah Everett, for example, my Gantz cousins, they're also descended, have another line of descent in common with me through another branch of their family. So that could also partly account for the DNA that we share. So in this case, I make a note here that says the above matches share another Reed Blackwell lineage in addition to the Pearson Everett ancestry. And then also there are some matches that I have with cousins that are descended from Keturah Everett Pearson's ancestors. They're not descended from Keturah, but they're descended maybe from her father or her grandfather, her grandmother. So that also gives me confirmation of my genetic lineage down from Keturah, because I'm matching people that are descended from her relatives. So I'm just showing this as as a way that I keep track. And the other thing I do is I keep a tree, and this is going back 4 generations, or to my fourth great grandparents rather, so it's 5 or 6 generations. And the green blocks are the ancestors for whom I have confirmed cousin matches through those ancestors. So in other words, it's sort of a green light genetically. It's confirmation of my historical research into the genealogical records. You'll notice that this is my dad's side of the family on the left, and this is my mom's side of the family on the right. Why are all these white or blank, you ask, on my dad's side of the family? Well, for 2 reasons. The ones that are blank are in Poland, and it's very difficult to do genealogical research that far back in Poland. So I don't know the names of some of the ancestors there, so I can't know whether or not someone's descended from them. The ones on the left-hand, far left, are his German ancestry, which is actually very well documented back to the 1500s. The reason that there aren't too many green boxes there is because DNA tests are outlawed in a good part of Europe, including Germany. So there's nobody in Germany doing DNA tests descended from these ancestors that I can confirm my lineage back to these ancestors through. There are people in America that are descended from other immigrants to America that might be descended that I can then confirm that we have these German ancestors in common. But a lot of these are white because I can't confirm through people in Germany that are descended from these same people, the lineage. The Klett lineage, actually, some of these should be green now. I have to change them to green going back to Klett ancestors because I did a Y chromosome test. My sons and I all did Y chromosome tests, and we matched someone who's descended from a Klett that came to Virginia in the 1750s from the same town as our ancestors. So I know that the Y chromosome is verified back to the generations that were living at that time. So those would be green. And you'll notice over on the far right, the upper part, there's some whites there. These are families that maybe had 1 child, and I haven't found the matches yet to those branches. But most everyone else on my mother's side of the family, I have multiple cousins that I've been able to trace back to these ancestors, and that confirms the genetic descent from them. And I also keep track for each of the immediate family members, just the DNA matches that I have and how they're related. So I have 2 case studies, and I'm going to see if I can get through them both. We'll see how much time we have. The first case study that I have is a New Jersey ancestor. Sarah Ashcraft's mother is the name of the case study, but I've subtitled it "Hoodwinked for 45 Years," or "Be Careful What You Assume," or "Hindsight is 2020," and you'll understand why I gave it those subtitles as we go along. So my ancestor, Sarah Ashcraft, lived in Trenton. She was raised in Philadelphia, and she was born in Gloucester County, New Jersey. This is my mother's 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 mother. So it's my all-female line going back to Sarah Ashcraft. This is the family monument for her in Riverview Cemetery. Now, this monument was erected after her husband, David Campbell, died in 1907. But you'll notice it says Sarah Ashcraft's dates are 1834 to 1868. She had a gravestone in Mercer Cemetery in Trenton, and then her husband was widowed for nearly 40 years, and so after he died and bought a new plot for the family in Riverview Cemetery, they had her remains reinterred in River Cemetery, and his family erected this family monument showing his dates, his wife's dates, even though she had died 40 years earlier, and then presumably his mother-in-law, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So it gives her birth date as 1834, and therein lies the problem, because just because it's etched in stone, it doesn't mean it's etched in stone. you want to trust every document that you find, but sometimes documentation is wrong. And this 1834 date led me to assume certain things about her and her parentage and her ancestry, and you'll see what happened as a result. So again, Louisa L. Ashcraft, 1808, looks like a good date for her mother. She'd be about 28 or 20, 26. 1808 to 1890 is also listed on this family monument. Now, I was able to find at the State Archives in Trenton the newspaper article relating to the marriage of David Campbell and Sarah Ann Ashcraft. And this was very early in my research, probably 1978, 79, when I was 14 or so. And I started going to the State Archives. And it gave, in the Trenton newspaper, the marriage between David Campbell and Sarah Ann Ashcraft of Philadelphia. And it gave the minister's name, Reverend O. Douglas. So this was an important clue. That gave me their marriage in 1851. And then I also found the obituary or the death notice of Louisa L. Ashcraft in 1890. And it says, entered into rest on the 1st of October, 1890, Louisa L., widow of the late William B. Ashcraft, in the 83rd year of her age. Then it invites people to the funeral. It says interment private, but we know that she was buried in Riverview Cemetery. So this all sounded pretty good. Looked like Louisa was Sarah's mother, after all. And I'll remind you, though, that in this chart that I keep verifying the DNA lineages, Louisa Ashcraft, her maiden name was Leddon, is here, and her parents are up here, and they're shown as white. They're not green. Sarah was the only child to have children and descendants. And so I've traced Louisa Leddon's ancestry for many, many years, for 45 years. I've traced 20,000 relatives of hers. Yet there were no matches to anybody that were descended from her ancestors or, her immediate relatives. And so this was a little bit concerning and wasn't making a whole lot of sense. So I'm continuing the research on Louisa Ashcraft and Sarah. This is the 1850 census in Philadelphia, and it shows Louisa Ashcraft, age 42, so that matches up with the 1808 birth year on the gravestone. And then two daughters, Sarah, who's shown as 18 years old, and Amanda, who's shown as 20 years old. Now, Sarah, my ancestor, is shown as 18, that puts her birth at about 1831-32. Oh, I'm sorry, go back. Don't forward yet. So that puts her birth at 1831-32. Remember, the gravestone said she was born in 1834. But 1831 and 1832 didn't necessarily create a problem, because you'll find out in the next couple of slides, William Ashcraft married first, but his first wife died in 1830. So it appeared still that Louisa was my ancestor Sarah's mother, and she's living here. And this sister Amanda was actually remembered by my grandmother and her siblings as their Aunt Amanda Rush. So we knew that there was an Aunt Amanda that was the sister of Sarah Ashcraft, because when my ancestor Sarah Ashcraft Campbell died in 1868 in her 30s, and there's a lot of interesting stories associated with this family. She had a portrait that was supposed to pass down in my family, and one of the sons asked if he could have it temporarily. And then when he died, his widow, who didn't like any of the family, apparently had the funeral director roll it up and put it in her dress and get buried with it. So we lost the portrait. That's one of the stories. She died from a goiter, which the doctor in 1868 had given her medicine for, which caused the goiter to suffocate her. So that was another interesting story about, a tragic story about her. But she's in her 30s, and she leaves 5 minor children behind with her husband. And so this woman, Louisa Ashcraft, who would appear to be her mother, and the other woman, Amanda Rush, who was a widow by then herself, moved from Philadelphia to Trenton to help raise my great-grandmother and her siblings, the children of Sarah Ashcraft. So obviously this family is very close, and it seems to all be fitting together. Back when I was in college in Philadelphia, I went to the Philadelphia City Archives, and I got the estate records for William B. Ashcraft, and that all aligned. Louisa was the administratrix of his estate. And I found over the years, I figured out that William Ashcraft, Louisa was his second wife. He had married in 1828 to a woman named Hannah Jackson. And in fact, when he died in Philadelphia in 1841, his wife Louisa brought him back to Gloucester County, New Jersey, and buried him next to his first wife, who had died at the age of 23. And that's their gravestones in the Little Methodist Burial Ground in Aura, New Jersey, which is in Elk Township. And on the left is the gravestone of my ancestor, William B. Ashcraft, who died in 1841 in his 40s. And then his first wife, who dies at 23. And you can see in the tombstone, and I have an enlargement of the tombstone here, but they're buried next to each other. This tombstone is a small tombstone, but it's wonderfully informative. It says, in addition to her name, Hannah Ashcraft, it says that she's the daughter of John and Amy Jackson, and that she departed this life in 1830 at the age of 23 years, 10 months, and 12 days. She was just 23. So again, remember, we're not getting any matches though for Louisa Ledden, Ashcraft, and her parents. Why? I've traced 20,000 relatives. I wrote a whole series of articles about her German ancestry and 13 other families from Germany that immigrated with them just because I wanted to be thorough. There's lots of folks that I know and I'm in touch with that are in Ancestry DNA, but I'm not showing any matches to any of them. And so what happened was a relative of Hannah Jackson contacted me. And I wrote him an email and I said, well, I'm not actually descended from Hannah Jackson, the first wife of William B. Ashcraft. I'm descended from his second wife, Louisa Ledden. This is what I believed for 40 years. And then I thought, or am I? So I decided I would go back and look at everything that I had collected over the last 40 years about Sarah Ann Ashcraft's age. There were all kinds of census records, obituaries. The gravestone was just one thing. That says she's born in 1834, but there were many other documents, even though she had a very short life and died in her 30s, there were other documents listing her age. So I looked at the two obituaries that I had for her in the Trenton newspapers from 1868. And both of them said she was 36 in 1838, or 68. So that puts her birth in 1831, 32. Clearly 1834, there's a problem with 1834. 1831, 32 is what would line up with these obituaries. Then I looked at the 1860 census for her and her husband. And that shows her listed as aged 30. Now her husband is not a round number. He's shown as 38, and that matches the birth date I have for him. So this puts her birth at 1830, if she's 30 years old in 1860. Or even 1829, if she hit 31 that year. Then I looked at the census records for her father in Philadelphia in 1840. And it's hard to see, I know, on this slide, but the circle is around the age 10 to 14 years, and he has two females in his household aged 10 to 14. That would be Amanda and Sarah, who are listed with their mother in 1850. But they're aged 10 to 14 in 1840. That puts their birth between 1826 and 1830. So that again is saying that Sarah is older than her tombstone by potentially 4 years. And that's William Ashcraft down there, and you can see the number 2 in that column right there, which is age 10 to 14. So Sarah is born by 1830, according to the census records for her father. And in 1830 census, remember her father's first wife, Hannah, died that year. he's shown with a little girl under 5 years old. And that would also tend to confirm that he's got a daughter born by 1830. And that's his entry down there, under 5 years of age, for the one female that he has. There's no adult female in the house. It's him, probably some farm workers, and then his daughter, who's under 5. Then I went back and I looked at those estate records that I had for William B. Ashcraft that I'd copied in Philadelphia many, many, many years ago. And I started reading them a little bit more carefully. And this is a lesson for me in always reading everything very carefully and very critically, because once I made the assumption that Amanda and Sarah were both daughters of William B. Ashcraft, and their ages in the 1850 census were 18 and 20, I started building additional assumptions based on that. But when I went back and I looked at the estate papers for William B. Ashcraft in Philadelphia, it says the deceased died intestate, leaving a widow who administered, and one child, viz. His daughter Sarah Ann, a minor under 14 years of age. He only had one daughter. Amanda is not his daughter, even though she's listed as Amanda Ashcraft in the 1850 census, if you remember from a few slides back. So here's where it says a minor daughter, one child, Sarah Ann. So then I decided I better start looking at this Jackson family. And I started researching Hannah Jackson's family, and she was the daughter of John Jackson and Amy Watson. And they had 10 daughters, possibly a son. His obituary said he had been father of 11 children, but I've only been able to account for 10 daughters. A lot of daughters. And in his will in 1843, so keep in mind, his daughter Hannah died in 1830. Her husband William died in 1841. Both of them are dead. John Jackson in his 1843 will makes a point to list the daughters that had already received their inheritance. And this is a very important document. And it says, the bottom section there, it says, "Fourth, these my 5 daughters, which I now name, Mary Goff, Amy Abbott, Hannah Ashcraft, Elizabeth Garrison, and Ann Mead, all these my 5 daughters have had their full share out of my estate." This is 1843. Why would he bother to make a point of that with a deceased daughter who died at 23, her surviving widower who had remarried died at 41? Why would he do this if there weren't heirs? This in itself suggests that Hannah Ashcraft had left an heir. So I said, maybe I better check and see if I have any matches to descendants of John and Amy Jackson and their other 9 daughters. So I plugged in John and Amy Jackson in my matches. And I found about 150 matches after I had done some research tracing the other 9 daughters. And that told me the rest of the story that I never could have known, which is that Louisa Ledden, who grew up in the same church as William B. Ashcraft and Hannah, and whose ancestors are in that same cemetery in Ara, married William B. Ashcraft, a young widower with a baby girl. She was probably a widow with a baby girl herself. They came together and merged their families, and she raised Sarah Ashcraft as her daughter. When Sarah Ashcraft Campbell, my ancestor, died in her 30s, Louisa and her other daughter, or her actual daughter, who was a widow then, came to Trenton and raised these children that weren't even biologically related to them. So I didn't feel bad about tracing 20,000 relatives of hers because they were my adopted relatives and she's my honorary ancestor anyway. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't survive because I wouldn't exist, because my great-great-grandmother, she raised, and when her father died in 1841, when she was just 11, she raised her to marry her to a Trenton man, and the rest is my family history. So now I look at my through lines, and this is my through lines now that I've fixed my family tree and plugged in John Jackson. And these are just the ones that Ancestry can find. There's many more, as I mentioned to you, there's 150 of them. So these are all other daughters of John Jackson, and you can see 7 DNA matches, 6 DNA matches across the board, 4 DNA, 10, 2. These are all DNA matches from John Jackson now that I have my family tree corrected. And so now my little chart, we can advance one slide, fills in, by the way, those were filled in the meantime, but those fill in green now, and I've confirmed my genetic lineage back to John Jackson and Amy Watson. And of course, Hannah Jackson, who died at 23, having had one child. And she may very well have died in childbirth. I don't know the answer. But anyway, so that's the one case study. We have a few minutes. Are you all up for a second case study? Because it's a little bit more local. All right, we'll keep going then. Is that all right, Bob? All right. So the second case study is about Ezekiel and Israel Everett. And I've subtitled that one, Just When You Think You Know What You're Talking About. You get a sense of a theme here. And both of these case studies, I think, are really important lessons for me and anyone else that's paying attention to being very careful with your documentation and making assumptions. Because things can appear a certain way, and you might think, oh, you figured it out. When you dig a little deeper, there's something more there that can account for a DNA match, for example. So in this case, it has to do with the Everett family. They lived in Cranberry, New Jersey, and then West Windsor. And then my great-great-grandmother, Keturah Everett, married Joe Pearson from Lawrenceville, and they came to Hopewell. So this is all part of the local families that I'm descended from. And Thomas Smith Everett is my great-great-grandmother, Keturah's grandfather, and he's born in 1832. And his baptism is recorded at the Presbyterian Church in Cranberry. And so I knew his ancestry, and I knew that his parents were Martha and Ezekiel Everett. And also because his father had died, Thomas Smith Everett was born in 1793, died in 1832. His father died in 1794 when he was just a year old. But because he and his sister and brother had to choose their guardians, their parentage is also documented in that way. And in Thomas S. Everett's guardian bond in 1810 in Middlesex County, Cranberry's in Middlesex County, he names John Everett and Israel Everett as his guardians. And I always thought, well, maybe these are his uncles. It would make sense. You know, his father's deceased. Who are John Everett and Israel Everett? So I did a little research on Israel Everett and John Everett, and I could document roughly when Israel Everett's vital dates were. And so I could sort of come up with a tentative tree that probably Ezekiel and Israel were brothers, maybe. Thomas Smith Everett's sister, Mahala, also named Israel Everett as a guardian, so there was good evidence that he was a close relative of some kind. And that's where things stood for about 30 years, because I was stuck on that family, and I was never able to prove Ezekiel Everett's parents. I had my suspicions. He came from Ulster County, New York, to Trenton during the time of the Revolutionary War. Fortunately, he advertised that he had horses stolen from his late estate in Ulster County, New York, when he got down here. So I knew what his origins were, and I could put him in the context of a family in there, but I didn't have proof of his parentage. But were they brothers, Israel and Ezekiel? Possibly. Then I did the DNA test, and I started coming up with matches to people that were Everetts and were, in fact, descended from Israel Everett. Well, that's a good sign, right? It sounds like maybe that's our connection through the Everett family. And I should point out, when you're talking about these autosomal DNA matches, how far back you can consider them reliable for, in terms of the amount of DNA that you might share with people that are descended from ancestors going back. For someone in my generation, the autosomal DNA is pretty reliable back to the generation that's born in the 1750s, 1760s. You're going to get high enough matches where you can sort of draw conclusions about the shared ancestry. For my aunt, it goes back another generation. So you're talking about spitting in a tube in a couple years ago, 2020, say, when my aunt did it. Spitting in a tube in 2020, proving your lineage back to people born in the 1720s. It's pretty remarkable when you think about it, because you have the shared DNA as measured by centimorgans. So it's really important, if you have older relatives that are living and you're doing the DNA testing, to convince them to spit in the tube too. Because one generation closer back to your ancestors may mean the difference between proving something and not being able to prove it at this point. Anyway, so I had these matches to descendants of Israel Everett, and I wanted to look into them a little bit more. These are just different ones that are shown as, you know, fourth, fifth cousins. That's lining up pretty well with, it's a little higher than I would have expected if we're talking about an ancestor born in the 1720s or 30s, but still, they're valuable matches that I'm finding. And they're showing 20 to 85 centimorgans is reliably a fourth cousin. So that's lining up with what I'm hoping. And this is, you can't really see it, but I'll zoom in a little bit. This is the family tree that one of those cousins that is an Everett descendant had up online. And it shows her ancestry back to Mary Everett here through the Dalby family. And then it also goes on to show who Mary Everett was, the daughter of Israel Everett and Mary Gapin. Well, I'm looking at that Israel Everett, I'm thinking, is that the one that my ancestors named as a guardian? The potentially the brother of my ancestor Ezekiel Everett. That sounds awfully good to me. He's in New Jersey. So I start researching this Mary Gapin, who's supposed to be Israel Everett's wife, according to the documentation. And fortunately, this tree had some good documentation attached to it, some good documentary sources that I could then look into. So for the documentation for Israel Everett and Mary Gapin, it said that she's born about 1740 in Philadelphia, and she marries first to a man named Stephen Pearson, and then she marries to Aaron Mershon, and then she ultimately marries third to Israel Everett. And then she has children by each of the three husbands. So on the right-hand side, you'll see that's a tree that I created for the people that are descended from Israel Everett. And the question is, are these two Israels the same guy? I'd like them to be. That would explain why I'm getting DNA matches to his descendants. So I started looking at the documentation about Israel Everett and Mary Mershon. And this is their marriage bond from 1777. And it's got his signature there. This is at the records, in the records of the state archives, where I work. And so I thought, well, let me start comparing the signatures. I know that this is the Israel Everett who marries Mary Gapin in 1777. What are the signatures I have for the Israel Everett that's the guardian of my ancestors look like? So this is from the estate file in the Middlesex County Surrogate's office from when he signed the guardian bond in 1810. And then this is the 1777 marriage bond. And these are close. They're not perfect matches, but 33 years have gone by. The people's signatures can change a little bit. The writing implements change a little bit. They look very similar. But then I looked at the 1777 witness to a will that the one that married Mary Gapin signed, and that looks even closer to the 1810 signature that I have for the guardian of my ancestors. And then in 1779, he witnesses another estate. And so these are not perfect matches, but I'm convinced that this is the same guy, because the way that he writes his capital E, the way that he puts the tail down at the end of the name Everett, the way that he writes his R's in Israel and how he loops the S down, it's pretty consistent. You're not going to find anyone's signature exactly the same twice, But if certain basic things are similar, you can start to draw some conclusions. And so there was no reason to think that these were two different people. They looked like they could certainly be the same person. So were they brothers? Maybe. I don't know yet. But I concluded that they are the same person. Whether he's my ancestor's brother, I concluded that they are the same person. So I moved that part of the tree over to my tree. And this makes sense. I don't know how Israel and Ezekiel are related, but they seem to be related because we have these DNA matches and everything's making some sense. But who's their common ancestor? This is where we, I think, share some DNA. So I started looking into Israel Everett a little bit. And I find that the ancestry DNA record for him shows a source as the published volume of Princeton graduates. He had a son, Nicholas, by his wife, Mary, who graduated from Princeton University. And it turns out that Israel was a schoolmaster in Princeton, and his son, Nicholas, went to the university. And this is Nicholas's biography in the Princetonian's book. This is a biographical dictionary of Princeton graduates from 1790 to 1794, that particular volume. And it says, his father, Israel Everett, a local school teacher, married the twice widowed Mary Gapin Pearson Mershon on May 8, 1777. The Everetts were communicants of the Princeton Presbyterian Church, which I had known about Israel many, many years ago, occupying pew 39. A family history says that Israel Everett suffered an accident that necessitated the amputation of an arm. The fact that young Nicholas attended the Nassau Hall Grammar School suggests that the father probably taught there. The last reference to Israel Everett's presence in Princeton that has been found is for 1792. It is not known when Mary Everett was widowed for the third time. So this is building some meat on the bones of these people. It goes on to say, this is an interesting side note. On January 2nd, 1793, Israel was called before the faculty for bringing spirituous liquors into the college and becoming intoxicated. I have another ancestor who gave the students liquor, and he was charged for that. So apparently it runs in the family. Because of his usual good conduct, his admission of guilt, and there appearing circumstances to palliate it, the faculty considered it sufficient punishment to admonish him before his class and to mention his offense before the assembled student body. Anyway, that's just an aside. I kept reading, and the sources for this Princeton book gave Grace Mershon's book, Peter Mershon and His Descendants. So I thought I would check and see. They remember Mary Gapin, Israel Everett's wife, had married twice before she married him, once to a Mershon. So I looked at the Mershon book, which we have at the State Library. I won't read this whole thing, but the bottom line is it talks about an episode during the Revolutionary War in which Mary Gapin Pearson Mershon Everett, she was still Mershon at that time, her husband was shot in the forehead in the Battle of Long Island. She's a widow with these teenage daughters living in Princeton near the battlefield. And the British troops show up and force their way into the house. And this is a recounting by her daughter or granddaughter of this story. It says, at the Revolutionary period, the older ones were well into their teens, and they and other girls and the other young girls were kept concealed by their mother from the British soldiers. Among the numerous, sorry, I got to move this on my, so I can read it here. Among the numerous stories handed down by Aaron, that's her second husband's posterity, we recite the following. One evening when the girls were with the families in the large living room, several British soldiers broke into the house, and the leader remarked, well, where did all these pretty girls come from? And as he walked up to Elizabeth and tried to make her look at him, her mother, this is Mary Gapin Pearson Mershon Everett, Her mother, with the fire tongs as a weapon, told him not to dare touch her daughter. He replied, "Put down your tongs, mother, I won't harm your daughter." "Not without a fight," said the mother. After teasing them for a while, the soldiers peaceably departed. This is Mary Gapin Pearson, Mershon Everett. Hold on a second. Okay. So you can advance. So who's the common ancestor here? Well, we know that Mary Gapin's first husband, according to the genealogy, was Stephen Pearson. We know that she married second to Aaron Mershon. And the Mershon genealogy goes on to say, assuredly, Mary Gapin Pearson was a brave woman and a wonderful mother, yet she must have possessed more alluring feminine qualities, since in the following spring, by marriage license of May 8, 1777, she became the wife of Israel Everett of Somerset County, who was a teacher in Princeton. To Mary and this third husband were born two children, Nicholas Everett, who's the graduate of Princeton and practiced law in New York, and Mary Amelia Everett, of whom we shall speak later. Mary Amelia Everett, if you remember from the tree, is the one that the DNA matches are descended from. Aaron Mershon was only about 30 years old when his life was terminated by the British battle shot in his forehead, as an eyewitness related to his wife Mary, while she, through all the vicissitudes of her three families, was spared to a good age. The family history says she spent her last days among her daughters, who had pioneered to southwest Pennsylvania. And then this is where my jaw dropped, this last paragraph. It says, her youngest daughter, Mary Amelia Everett, had journeyed thither in 1796 with her half-sister, Jane Mershon Hartupi, and family, and later married her own cousin, Zachariah Gapin, of Greene County. Before the birth of their fourth child, the husband died, and for 9 years, Mary Amelia taught school to support her little flock, while the mother lived with her and helped care for the household. Eventually, Mary Amelia married second Israel Dalby. This is the line that comes down to my DNA matches. And it was their granddaughter, Lucy Dalby, who put into writing these many family stories which had come so directly to her. And then it says this. Thus relieved of responsibility in Mary Amelia's family, the mother spent her remaining years with Pearson and Mershon children. The record says of the Pearson daughters, Martha married first Ezekiel Everett and second John Gordon. Now, if you remember my tree, which I know at this hour it might be hard to do, but I'll show you why. My whole situation just exploded. Because this is my ancestor here, Ezekiel Everett. His children's name is Israel Everett as their guardian. His wife is Martha. For 40 years, I didn't know who Martha was. And I just found out by researching these people who Martha was. Martha, who marries Ezekiel, first Ezekiel Everett and then John Gordon, is the daughter of Mary Gapin and Stephen Pearson. Mary Gapin, her mother, marries Israel Everett, and she marries Ezekiel Everett. I still don't know whether the mother and daughter married two brothers, but that's what it looks like to me. But these two, I still don't know their relationship. But Israel Everett's descendants and I are all descended from Mary Gapin of the fireplace tongs fame, who's fending off, protecting her daughters from the British soldiers. And that explains the DNA match, at least at one level. I still don't know if they're shared DNA with the Everett line. But that was an entirely unexpected common ancestor that I found in a very, very roundabout way, but it explains the DNA match, which I was assuming must have come through the Everett family, but in fact it comes through Mary Gapin. at least through Mary Gaven. So she's my ancestor, and I'm very proud of her for raising those tongs and protecting her daughters. And that both of those give me lots of more things to look up. And that's the purpose of genealogy, isn't it? To find other reasons to look more things up. So that's my presentation. And thank you all for coming. And I think it's a little over the time that's allotted, but I think we can probably allow for a couple of questions if anyone has any questions. Yes. Yes, those are my own invention. The chart with the green boxes and the spreadsheet, those are all just things that I created. But Ancestry, and I didn't necessarily show it to you, but Ancestry allows you to notate matches. So you can put stars in matches, you can designate, I don't know if you noticed, but under each match, I say there's 2 surnames. That's the couple that I share the descent from. So you can create groups in your Ancestry matches, you can make notations designated who your common ancestors are, and you can also just write narrative notes about each one on Ancestry.
And went on road trips and cemeteries and park offices and find a lot of the genealogy on the park side of the family, and left me with a lot of documentation and a physical degree. Would any of that documentation to upload it into Ancestry?
Yes, so you can do whatever you want with your Ancestry account. I have a family tree. I don't keep track of all of my relatives on Ancestry. I have a tree showing my direct ancestors, because that way it will establish matches for me through lines and other ways. And people can find me by searching the surnames that are in my direct ancestors. But you can do whatever you want with your ancestry tree. I know people with tens of thousands of people in their ancestry tree. My genealogy database, after 47 years of researching, has about 125,000 people in it. I'm not going to put that in Ancestry at this point, but a lot of people build their trees initially at Ancestry, and then they illustrate them with the documentation that they find, which you can get images from Ancestry and other sources, and put it right there with your family's record, that person's record. So yeah, you can use Ancestry to do that as well. Again, this is not an endorsement or promotion for Ancestry. I just find it to be very useful to doing this kind of research with genealogy matches. Yes.
So you're working at the state archive.
Yes. You can after you make an appointment, but it's open to the. Let's repeat. The question was, can the gentleman walk into the state archives to do research? And the answer is, right now we have research by appointments. It was something that we instituted during COVID because we had to limit the number of people that could come in. We found that it was very useful to have people make appointments because, especially in our manuscript reading area, which is where you might use more obscure sources that aren't microfilmed, we found that it really helped the researcher out a lot if they told us what they were looking for. It saved them time by pulling everything that they wanted to look at. They can still ask for other things while they're there, but if we can put everything on a cart for you that we know you're going to want to look at, then it saves you the time while you're there to filling out the request forms and all of that. So we just kept going with the appointments. And right now we're open Monday through Thursday. We're not open on Fridays. And there are 2 appointment slots, one from 9 in the morning till 12 noon, and then one from 1 p.m. to 4. We have a break in between where we're not open. The staff takes their lunch break. But you can sign up for a couple of appointments in one day or a couple in a week. So yeah, you just have to make that appointment. If you show up, we're not going to kick you out. We'll try to find a place for you. But the microfilm readers do fill up, so we can't find a place for you if there is no place. So it's best if you make the appointment in advance. Yes.
You mentioned 2 relatives based upstate, right? Philadelphia.
Yes.
So that's a famous Elizabeth.
So my Aunt Amanda Rush, my great Aunt Amanda Rush, married into the Philadelphia Rush family. I don't really know his ancestry. They didn't have children. He's not well documented. He served in the Civil War, but I don't know how he might be related to Benjamin Rush. But I assume that he is one way or another, but they're not my direct ancestors. This is an interesting situation because my grandmother, when I was growing up, said, "You're descended from Benjamin Rush," because she knew that she had this aunt, Amanda Rush. Well, it was her great grandmother's stepsister's husband. We're not descended from the Rush family at all. But those things happen in family trees or in family lore. The Fish family, my fish lineage on my mother's side goes back to New England, and Hamilton Fish and all of the fishes in that political family are descended from the same family, but the ancestor in common is born about 1580. So I can't claim any close connection, but I have a cousin who's an actor and he really wanted to try to get into that HBO series or whatever it was, where they were talking about, I forget what it is, the Gilded Age maybe. And he was trying to, he knew the producer and he was trying to convince the producer to do a whole segment on Mary Fish, who's I think Hamilton Fish's mother. And she would throw these elaborate parties and tell everybody that the prince of so-and-so was going to be there. And it turned out that he was a chimpanzee. And anyway, so he wanted to play her close relative, and he claimed that he was a close relative of Mary Fish, but he's more like an eighth cousin, but he didn't want to hear that from me. Anyway, I digress. Any questions online, Bob? All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.